My name is Akusia Hansen. I work in radio and TV in Ghana, and I'm also the director of Drama Queens, which is a non-profit feminist Pan-African theatre organization. And for today, I'm actually going to be the moderator of this, what promises to be a very, very engaging discussion. I really love the theme, and I'm glad we're here to discuss this together. This is an initiative of the Kwame Trust for Contemporary Art, which was set up in 2014 to advance the contemporary arts of Ghanaian and African origin.
What does it mean to you that I'm wearing an African print dress? And it's a dress that I've, not the fabric, but it's a dress that I actually designed myself.
One thing is certain, that we all have our prejudices. And another thing that is pretty certain is that artists, through their cultural, through their artistic expression, have an incredible potential, incredible power to actually challenge those stereotypes. And the British Council is very, very interested in this sphere. We work in arts and culture, and we have been for over 70 years. And then, two very bright artists, one from the UK, Diana Atuona, and Chief Mumin from Ghana, took the research and the mapping, and they created an incredible play, a play about a young female, Ghanaian female person who is trying to get on in politics. And she can't, despite her fantastic ideas and despite her fantastic political acumen. She cannot, because she is a woman. And things change for her only when she starts dressing up as a man, and when she pretends she's a man. And during the play, and the play was staged at the National Theatre here, just across the road, and during the play there were lots of ovations, there were oohs and ahs, and people were clapping, people were shouting and screaming. And there was a lady sitting next to me, and she, throughout the play, she kept on whispering into my ear. She kept on saying, "You know what, this is my life. This is what I'm experiencing." And I tell you, I was so very proud. I was so proud, because our play was actually challenging stereotypes. So, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you very, very interesting deliberations. This year, we are hoping to bring together young artists from Ghana and from the UK in a pop-up space. We're planning to do it in November. And we will task them to create an artistic expression of Ghana-UK relations now. So any ideas that you may have, and any interesting things that may come out of your seminar, will be very, very interesting to us, and I'm looking forward to it. So thank you very much once again for coming to our premises. You always more than welcomed here, and I wish you very interesting deliberations. Thank you.
She's raised very, very good points and questions that are actually going to drive the discussion. I like the talk about theater and challenging stereotypes and perceptions of women. She also mentioned cultural appropriation, and all this and more is what we're going to be looking at with our theme, Telling Tall Stories, the responsibility of the African artist in challenging African stereotypes. And to do that, I should invite our panelists now. I'll start with Mamia J, who is a multi-talented actor, creative artist, and producer. Now, since moving from Philadelphia back home to Ghana in 2013, Mame has delved into her love for the arts, moving away from her background in psychology and and healthcare, healthcare finance and administration. She chose to follow her interests, passions, and hearts into the creative fields, and we're thankful to her for doing that. Mami's focus is on telling stories that expand the vision and sometimes narrow perceptions of her continent. As a Ghanaian returnee from Philadelphia, Mamia J realized that she didn't know her country as well as she should, so she decided to explore her continent, starting with her own country, Ghana, and bring her audience with her. So Girl Going Places is a travel show about exploring our own, as Mami J puts it, and I'm going to quote from her. She says, 54 distinct countries, 30 million square kilometers of unadulterated beauty, hundreds of cultures, thousands of languages, and a plethora of landscapes to choose from. Best known for her work as actor and co-producer for the hit series An African City, Mami continues to pioneer and be a part of projects that are close to her heart and reflect her relationship with Africa. Now, Mami has also been featured in Essence Magazine, OK Africa, Huffington Post, Marie Claire, to name a few, and was recently named one of 15 African women to follow on social media by Essence, alongside Lupita Nyong'o, Tiwa Savage, and Bonang Mathiba. If you're not following her, please find a way to follow her now. A huge round of applause for Mami as she steps up. Thank you. And I would like to invite, at this stage, Professor Kwesi Wilson, who is a communication studies lecturer at the College of Alameda in California. He is a critical culture critic and also a co-founder and co-editor of AfricanTrumpets.com, a blog that purports to rouse the consciousness of Africans. In his free time, he enjoys the outdoors and staying fit and insists we just call him Kwesi. A round of applause for him as he steps up. Thank you. And at this stage, I'd like to invite Isaac Nana Opoku, who says experimenting and taking risks is in his DNA. His fervor for adventure is expressed in his ever-evolving work, which explores wide-ranging themes and media steeped in Ubuntu, driven by oneness, the deep sense of interconnectedness he feels with life. Primarily a self-taught artist, he is passionate about learning and education and how far we can stretch our minds and push the collective human imagination. He's a founding director of Cocoa 360, a sustainability-driven nonprofit pioneering a model for rural healthcare delivery and girls' education in Ghana. Now, Nana, as he prefers to be called now, is the winner of the 2017 Kwenyehia Prize for Contemporary Ghanaian Art, and you can view his entry on Instagram at Afroscape. A round of applause for Nana as he steps up. I would like to invite Sefa Gohoho Boateng. She is an entrepreneur who is making her career out of being a capacity builder and a luxury brand custodian. She is the CEO of Songhai Africa, a company that focuses on 3 investment sectors: luxury consumables, hospitality, and agri-business. One of such businesses is Untamed Empire, which has been described as the Colette of Accra. Untamed Empire tells a story surrounded by the myth of the power of one's creativity. The name Untamed denotes disruption and tension. It represents an ideology that communicates our cultural code, that an ancient belief that creativity makes us godlike, and I totally agree. The business, however, is simple. With one store in Accra, it aims to be a growing network of 15 multi-brand, multi-channel serviced retail concept stores in different African countries. She is the co-founder of Canoe Magazine, a founding member of Africa 2.0, and chairman of the Africa 2.0 Foundation Ghana Board. She was educated in Ghana, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and England. Sefa is an alumni of the London School of Economics. Please, a huge round of applause for her as she steps up. Let's get straight to business. Telling tall stories, the responsibility of the African artist and challenging stereotypes. I want to actually begin this conversation with a quote that was shared with me from Dr. Odibo Freeborn. And it says, does authentic African identity refer to the person of the artist, their original background? It's his, but I'm actually making it more gender neutral, or their affiliation with Africa. What authentic identity indicates the form of an art piece, its content, theme, or motive? What if a Western artist, non-African, produced works in an African style? Will such an artist or the work be branded African, European, American, fraudulent, or modern? Can we say that the person of the artist and the work produced must show particular traits to be branded or have an authentic identity? I remember in my second year of philosophy class at University of Ghana, this was a question that was in my mind. What is African? You know, and I never answered it because philosophy, you get to never answer questions. But I wanted to throw that question to you. What is African?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. But I think we as Africans define what is African to us. You know, I think being African is being authentic to your African experience, to your Africanness. And I think whatever that means to you, that is African in your context, in your cultural context, in your relationship with your community. So I don't think there's one definition of what African is. It really is about what is authentic to your experience as an African or just as a participant in the African narrative.
So how would you describe your African experience? What's your experience of being African, Kwesi?
I think I will have to second her. What is African is not static, it's constantly changing, but it's also your lived experience of living in Africa. And many a times we hear folks trying to really minimize what an African is. I'll give you an example. When the Ebola thing happened, it became an African thing, as opposed to a small section. And instead of poverty, instead of well-being, instead of wealth, there's a wide host of what an African experience is. And so it's really hard to really just kind of like minimize it to just a small definition. It's fluid, it's vast, it's different things.
Yeah, I would have to agree with what Professor Kwesi said. It's almost impossible to, pin Africanness down to one thing, especially if you look at the fact that, people would want to define Africa or Africanness as whatever goes on within the borders of our continent, but I feel like it's more than that, especially if you think about the fact that everywhere else, all the other continents that are populated by people, like all those people came from Africa. So in a sense, you could extend the definition there as well. And then that shows you, I guess, the extent to which it's almost impossible to say, okay, this person or this thing is African. So it becomes a thing of defining it for yourself, like looking at experiences in your past, looking at what's going on now, and seeing your place within that, seeing how you can carve out a space or a definition, make meaning out of whatever it is that's going on. And if that is Africa or Africanness to you, that is your experience. So it's pretty much a very subjective and very personal thing to define. And so that's how I see it. That's what I think.
It's a little difficult for me to go last because I think the esteemed panelists have said it all, really. But the one thing I would like to add is that there are many Africas. The Africa of an African city is completely different to the Africa that you know and the Africa that I know. I grew up all over Africa. My father was a civil servant, so we lived in 7 different African cities. And the one thing I can say is there's so much that links us as Africans, yet there's so much that also we can celebrate individually and uniquely as people from different parts of Africa. So for example, you can be in DRC, and I think I was in DRC with you, and we had kontomire and fried plantain, not because they were trying to please us in any way, but it was part of their, their culture, part of what they do. So I think it's part of the challenge and part of the reason we're having this conversation is because people try too much to oversimplify it, and they try and reduce us to one thing. It's just not possible, like everyone here has said. And so I'm really excited that we're here and that we're having this dialogue, because I think it is in accepting our uniqueness as individuals within the African context, and then expanding our sphere and telling our stories so that we embrace other people who identify with the stories we can tell. I'm happy that we're having this chance to do this so that that's...
At this stage, I'm going to ask then, since
the African experience is supposed to be varied, right? And it's particular to to specific people and how they define it for themselves. What about the African stereotype? Is that a particular thing, or it's a varied thing? What is the African stereotype?
I think the African stereotype depends on who you ask, right? But I think there's one sort of prevailing idea of what an African is as far as a stereotype is concerned. It's just this sort of poverty-stricken, incapable of being self-sufficient, needing help to sort of run our affairs. And I think this is, and corruption, you know, there's always corruption. And I think that these themes have somehow held strong for so long about Africans and the continent that it's sort of the first point that people come to when they don't know Africa. So I think that those are sort of the prevailing themes that pop out. But I think it depends on who you ask, you know, and their experience with the continent and with Africans.
So, Kwesi, how would you define, okay, how would you talk about your first experiences with some stereotypes in your work, in your life, in you yourself being African? What stereotypes were placed on you, and how did you feel when those stereotypes were forced on you? And how did you try to change that stereotype?
My stereotype actually started, I never really saw who I was until I left this country. And I recall being in Palo Alto, California, where I met certain people. So I recall being in Palo Alto, California, and some folks who met me found out, you know, were interested in where I was from. They said I was from Ghana. And they said, the remark they made was, this must be different. And that kind of threw me off. What did they mean by that? And that was a question that kept coming back over and over again. And I always go back to something that Selassie, I forgot her last name. She wrote Ghana Must Go. She talked about the power being in the question, what they mean by the question. There's the relation to power. Where are you from? Ghana, low power. Where are you from? England, high power. And when people ask you questions like that, the real question is in what they meant with the question. And so to go back to the stereotypes is, again, that of passivity, right? And docile, and we're needing help, and we're incapable of helping ourselves, like she said. And so I don't know if I lost my train of thoughts, but that is what I think of when I think of the stereotypes of Africans, what I see. In my personal experience, that was what I look back and what I thought they were thinking of me as when they said this must be different.
All right, thanks so much for sharing that. So in a sense, with what you've said, we experience the fact that stereotypes can be dehumanizing, stereotypes exclude, and with stereotypes, you're dealing with prejudices and people's preconceived notions about you even before you've met them. And I'm gonna just throw this out, it doesn't have to be in that role. How do you think art then solves the problem that, say, for instance, policies and laws cannot change? So, for instance, the stereotype of a homosexual man as comic or disgusting, or the stereotype of women as second-rate human beings, the stereotype of a person with disability as not able to contribute to society. You know, how do you think art then does the job that laws and policies do not do? Anyone can take this.
Yeah, I'll take it. Because I was trying to make sense of, you know, the word, like in my own way, the African stereotype or stereotype. So it's like playing with the word, you know, thinking about it like stereotype. So yeah, trying to imagine something, right? And yeah, in the process, like I was like, you know, fiddling with the words, you know, it's like two different words, stereo and type. So I was like, maybe a good place to start is to imagine a stereotype as a type of spot on. So yeah, no. So imagine if you can, you know, a little stereo, like a radio, if we are going to be more specific, you know, these little devices with 2 speakers to create the feel that it's like the sound is surrounding you. Those little devices that we all know that are slowly becoming obsolete. Yes, so I'm thinking of this thing, and you know, we can all imagine what a regular radio looks like, maybe with a knob you can twist to tune in to whatever radio station it is, maybe something you can drag up and down. And yeah, you're going through it, you can hear some music sometimes. Ghana here, you hear some sermons, some news. Sometimes you wonder how some of these things are even considered as news stories. And if you're lucky, if you scroll all the way to the top, you might hear a lovely Akosia Hansen on YFM. But unfortunately, that's what the regular radio is like. The stereotype radio is nothing like that. You know how on a regular radio there might be an infinite number of stations you could tune into. You know, there are all sorts of possibilities, all sorts of megahertz and frequencies you could, you know, latch your ears onto. With the stereotype, unfortunately, you're not giving that many options. You're kind of limited to like a few ways of viewing or seeing the world. Like there's been a projection, a very limiting projection of how you can relate with people or an entity, a person, because there's an idea of what they are already, and so it's hard to think or see them in any other way. And so when it comes to African stereotypes, unfortunately, there are a bunch of surprising things out there, if you ask me. It's like we're almost 20 years into a new millennium, and there's still ideas like Africa as a country. And I'm like, wow, Africa is a country and Nigeria is the capital because that's where all the scammers are. Or, you know, Africa is so hot, oh my God, don't go there, you melt. Or, you know, crazy ideas like that. And you think it would end there, but there's a, you know, what Miss AJ said about, you know, corruption and us being portrayed as these diseased, poverty-stricken people. And it's incredible, it's amazing, and it's shocking that this still goes on now. And where I finally come to, you know, how artists play a role in it is, you know, it's important to tell the other stories, to share the other perspectives about what we are, who we are, and how our lived experiences have shaped us. Because it's not to say some of the things the stereotypes point to aren't true. Yes, there are poverty-stricken places. There are people who unfortunately are sick and need our help. Those are all a part of the story. But the danger of stereotypes is they make it seem as though that's the only story. And that, to me, is the big problem. And that's where artists come in, because we are storytellers. That's why we're here. That's why we drive culture and change. And that's why, I'm excited to be part of this. The people trying to have a discussion about this, to make this, to shift perceptions. Yeah, so that's why I think artists are important.
All right, let her finish then.
So this is why I love working with creatives, because they have this capacity to express themselves, be authentic, like you were talking about, and express themselves in a way that can spark a realm of possibility for anyone, no matter what discipline you're in, whether you're a doctor or you're an engineer or you're a scientist in, you know, planning to get their satellite to space. I think art has a very, to me, it's the most important role, where what you are able to create, what you're able to dig deep within and come out with, express what you see within yourself, that is truth to me. That is you being truly honest. And in you expressing that visually or through movies or through sculpture, whatever your medium is, maybe through song, when you are truly authentic, there's someone, I believe, who will see or hear or witness what you've created, and it'll spark something within them. So coming back to Africa and the African context, I'm someone who grew up in Zimbabwe. I was the only black girl in my school. So from very early on, I was faced with stereotypes. I'm also a woman trying to do business in Africa. Stereotypes, you know, they exist. And so very early on, I realized that there's no point dwelling on the stereotype. For me, at least, this is my perception. Because once you dwell on the stereotype, you focus too much on the other person and on trying to break the stereotype. All you can do is be authentic and be the best that you can be. In order to do that, I think one has to have a vision. And this is why art is important, because artists find a way to reveal what is within themselves, reveal that vision. And if they can do it, it forces everyone to confront themselves and find a way to find a solution to whatever a creative challenge may be in whatever you're doing. It comes in different ways. Sometimes it's in the morning when I wake up, oh, how am I going to prepare breakfast with, you know, just one egg and whatever. I have to create something. It happens when I'm at work and I have to negotiate a deal with someone. It happens when I'm here and I have to think of what to say. You know, it's only because of what he said that it sparked something within me. And I think to all the artists here, I applaud you because what you do is amazing. To the prize, I applaud you because giving them this platform to express themselves is so important. It's all important. But the one thing I also wanted to add that you sparked as well was when we were working on Canoe magazine with the brilliant and the talented Kweku Wansa and the team, we basically told stories of Africa. We celebrated the best of what there was on the continent, whether it was fashion or art or business people doing amazing things across the continent. We distributed it in 10 African cities, and we discovered that we had ignored a very big market, and that was the market of people who had relocated to Africa who were not African. And they were also dealing with the stereotype of them living in Africa. So we had these people who would come and buy Canoe magazine, and then they would go back to London or wherever, and they would have to try and convince people that, listen, don't feel sorry for me because you think I live in this impoverished, you know, part of the world. I live in a wonderful place with great creativity and amazing things. So the idea of a stereotype, sometimes you may not even realize how you can break a stereotype just by being yourself. And I think we oversimplify the issue of whether we're Africans or not, but I don't think we have the right to actually try and think about all that. I think all we can do is be true to ourselves, and whether we feel that we're global citizens and so we have a sense of what it means to be to exist on a global stage, but at the same time decide that we know what our roots are. I mean, the African story is so diverse, you know. At the moment, we've been through the stereotype of being slaves and colonialism and all of that, and now we exist where there's a whole nation or a continent of young people who consider themselves to be global citizens. The way they express themselves, some may feel is not African enough, but they identify with that. I think what those of us who have a sense of what the past was, and Chimamanda Adichie reminded me of this, where she said it starts with where you choose to start the story. If you choose to start the story from colonialism, then fine, it ends up being that you shouldn't want to be African, you should want to aspire to something else. But if you start from the true story of Africa, which is where civilization started, then you have a self-confidence that enables you to confidently tell your story and break whatever stereotypes that anyone might have of you. Okay, see.
If I say this a lot, if I was to take all forms of media away from us, what would we know? No TV, no radio, no forms of media. I say this almost every time I talk anywhere else because it's really important when we think about who we are as a people. We are the content we consume. And the sort of content you consume shapes how you think, how you feel, how you view the world, your worldviews, your ideologies, and whatnot. If there is a 360 window, if I lock you in a jail cell, and I give you one window to look at the world, that will be your reality. And you will fight, kill, and defend that reality. That becomes how you see the world. Whereas in actuality, there is 360 view out there. You're missing out on the rest of them. And so we realize what impact content makes on human thinking and how we view ourselves. And then you move from there, and then you look at those who are controlling or creating the content. And then you realize these people wield power. When I was in college, I was the editor for my school newspaper. And I would sit on the train and see folks reading articles that I've written. And I go, what if I was lying? What if it was fake news? It's a big thing now. I blog now, and I could write whatever I want. And you realize how important those who are creating content, what sort of power they wield on how we all see ourselves and how we think, how we interact, the stereotypes we have of each other. It didn't come from a vacuum. It came from content that was created and fed to us. And then you go, what are the motives behind the creation of those contents? And so you ask again, how can artists dispel some of these stereotypes? Artists are part of the content creators. They generate creators. It's actually, the arts is known also as the culture industry. It was the arts that was used to defeat the Soviets. They slid in American movies into that culture with the sole aim of shifting the thinking of the people away from the Soviet communist ideology to get them to westernize and want change. That was US's strategy. The Pentagon was responsible for sponsoring many of these movies with the sole aim of shifting. That was a part of the Cold War. And so content creators are really critical to dispelling this. Artists play an integral role in doing that.
All right, thank you so much for highlighting that, the power of content creators. What about when those who are receiving the content do not agree with the content creator? So for instance, where you mentioned how people will talk about how it's not Ghanaian enough. An African City, when season 1 came, there's a whole lot of conversation about how it's not Ghanaian and this is not the Ghanaian experience. Shirley Frimpong Manso herself as a filmmaker, there's so much talk about how she shows bougie Ghana, that's not really Ghana. So as content creators, as artists, how do you deal with your audience or readers or etc. saying this is not African enough?
I think that the first thing as an artist or content creator is to create what you know, right? So for An African City, Nicole, who's the writer of An African City, was telling the story of 5 women that she sees in her daily life. Now, whether everybody in the audience relates to that story, whether that's the story of them as Ghanaians, it's probably not. But the hope is that no matter who you are, you find something relatable within each character. So I don't think it's the job of the content creator to create work that everybody agrees with. That's not even art, when art is challenged, when art is pushed, that's what makes interesting art to me. It's not Ghanaian enough. Who defines what's Ghanaian? It's 5 of us sitting on this stage. We're all Ghanaian, but our experiences of being Ghanaian are very, very, very different. Even people that I grew up with and we sort of had the same path, same journey, our experiences of being Ghanaian is very different. So I think this idea of it's not Ghanaian enough, I actually think it's ridiculous, to be honest, because no one has a definition on that. It's our own individual experience. And I think that as artists, we have to have the courage. The way we break stereotypes is having the courage to tell your own authentic story, because it's going to be different than the next person's. And once there's more stories, that's more diversity, and that's how you break stereotypes.
I think for me, part of the issue is that the understanding of what it is to be Ghanaian. Fair enough, there's an average understanding of what the average Ghanaian, what their life is like. I think what would help all of us at all levels of being Ghanaian is being more inclusive and more understanding of what happens to other Ghanaians or with other Ghanaians. And I think that in learning from each other, it makes this challenge that we are trying to solve, which is to break stereotypes, all the more possible, because most of the stereotypes that hold us back are the stereotypes we have among ourselves. So we judge ourselves. I find Ghanaians, we're a little harsh sometimes. As much as we are soft at heart, sometimes we can be harsh to ourselves. And in judging ourselves, it holds us back from being more creative, breaking the boundaries, being the kinds of content creators we truly want to be. Because I think that in being inclusive, more comes with it, such as more funding for artists who are trying to produce content that they just can't afford to produce. It comes with creating new kinds of art. It comes with different types of artists working together to create things. So we had an event at Untamed Empire where an illustrator, Papa Opong, came up with this concept he drew. Then he found a designer to design, there were these giant coats, the designer designed the coats. Then they found a woodworker who does laser work on wood to put on the coats. They found a poet to write a script inspired by these coats. Then they built a 10-foot pole, 10-foot tall bird cage, and they got these 8 girls who were birds, and they had this beautiful theatrical performance simply because they were open and inclusive to the possibility of, working with different kinds of people. So the Ghanaian experience you talk about, 100%, everybody has a unique experience, but it is in being inclusive and being open to other people's experiences within the context in which you exist, and allowing them to also influence you in whatever way positively that they can. I think that helps create great things. And I think I applaud you and Nicole and your whole team for An African City, because you're not apologetic of the fact that, yeah, there are things that inspire us within Ghana. There are also things that we don't like. That's okay. And it should be applauded and it should be celebrated. I think people who spend too much time saying, oh, it's not Ghanaian enough, frankly, they don't have enough to think about and enough to do.
All right, thank you so much for that. So I'm gonna, thank you.
Can I add to
Piggyback
this real
off-
quick?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. One thing we should always think about when we're sending out messages is think about this. There are 3 things audience do when they receive messages. I talked about this the other day. They employ 3 codes. It's called the dominant code, the substitution code, and the negotiating code. The dominant code is they take in everything you give them and no questions asked. The negotiating code is they take part of it and spit out what they don't like. That happens in church a lot. You take what the pastor says, what you like, and discuss the ones you don't like. And then the substitution code is you completely dismiss the entire thing and substitute it with some other narrative. So whenever you're generating content, always understand that these are the things that could happen with the content you give to your audience. And there's one more thing I was going to say, but I lost my train of thought. So, do you remember? No, if I do, I'll come back. But I just wanted to let the people who create content know, we said, what does the audience, what role do they have to play? Well, some of them are taking in everything you're telling them. Some of them are negotiating, others are substituting, and you can never please everyone. But there's a wide number of stories that are happening, and they all need to be told. There's room for every story, and there should be room for every story. It's all about relativity, and that's what really should be the focus.
So I'm going to push this a little bit. A lot of the language you've all expressed today has been about how the artist has to be true to themselves and be authentic to themselves. So the question is then, does the African artist have to challenge the African stereotype? Is it a must that they do this? One, if it's not lucrative for their work, is it a must they do this? Two, there's a point of view where the artist is supposed to move with the spirit and with their vibe, and to give them a political cause, such as to fight the African stereotype, becomes limiting. So is it the artist's job, the African artist's job, considering the world we're in now, in this time, in 2017, and all that's happening with Africa in the world, is it a must to challenge the African stereotype?
Okay, so I'm going to beat a dead horse a little bit, because I feel like if, as an African artist, you are staying true to your experience in the context of where you're from, and you're using that in your art, I don't think that you have to consciously fight the African stereotype. I feel like within your work, it is innate that you're telling a unique story that will be different than this very narrow view of what exists about Africa. So I don't think that it's a mandate that you have to take on. I think the mandate that you have to take on is to be courageous and tell an authentic story. If you're doing that, I feel that inherently will break down stereotypes about where you're from.
I feel as though, and I said this earlier on, if you were to give Ghanaians $10 zillion to solve their problems, and you leave with the intention to come back 10 years later to see if they solve the problems, by show of hands, which one of you, who here thinks the problems will be solved? Who here thinks the money will be gone and the problems will be here?
Oh, shame on you.
Ghana and most of Africans do not have a money problem. We don't. We have a mental posture problem. I don't see the solution to all our problems as coming from the top up, having a good leader. I don't think that's the solution. I honestly, truly do not believe that is the solution. Because if you have a great leader with all the best intentions, and everyone is going this way, and you're going that way, the force will push you around. You will be undermined by the people you're working with. And so the solution to most of all our problems, I will actually say is the panacea to all our problems, is how we shift our mental posture. And the arts is the only agency that can do that. Not politics, not big money, nothing but the arts, because they are the culture industry. And so, is it a mandate? Given the volume of problems, the enormous number of problems we have, I would think it should be, if not a mandate, a crusade. Because we have work to do. We need to solve these problems. And the only industry best equipped to shift our thinking, to align it in a direction that's conducive to our development is the arts. I strongly believe that. So it's almost a mandate.
Wow. So I think I agree with, on both sides of the in between both sides of the debate. To like a large extent, I agree that all that needs to be done as an artist is just stay true to who you are and just keep pushing your narrative and insist on just being genuine And in that way, it tells a story that needs to be heard. And if it's heard, it adds to the collective stories that make us who we are. But on the other hand, it's like we need to be conscious of what is happening, how a dominant group imposes a story on us that becomes our story if nothing else is done. And so from that perspective, it is our responsibility. And not, I wouldn't say, I don't want to assume, but I don't think every single artist is aware or looks at things this way. And so it is the responsibility of those who do to make it clear that, yes, there is a problem which needs to be solved, but it isn't necessarily a problem in that sense. Like, you can just keep doing what you're doing, keep staying true to your work, and it will also be making a difference anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, to add to what everyone has said, the idea of artists keeping true to themselves, but at the same time being faced with real practical issues like money and being corrupted by money. Sometimes we have to realize that the idea of creating content and following those who you think are supporting you in creating content are sometimes the ones that end up corrupting your art. So in you signing with a particular gallery that you think is going to get you famous can end up meaning that because of the powers and what they expect of you, because they have that stereotype of what your art is supposed to be like, you end up reproducing the same thing. And we see this, I don't want to mention any names, but we see this where a lot of Ghanaian artists end up going with a particular gallery, and the gallery's interest is not necessarily to develop the artist as the artist should develop, but to sell their work. And so then what happens is they become forced to reproduce work all the time, and then they no longer delve within and stay true to their art. So yes, absolutely, the only way we can solve this problem is through art. But we have to understand that in order to do that, there has to be support in so many different ways, from different disciplines, from those who are the business people, those who are the patrons who want to patronize and buy African art. That's one way of supporting. From people who own spaces where they can show art, just simply for people to come and experience it and be inspired. They also need to fulfill their part. So I'm saying that each of us within the space has to fully do what we're supposed to do in order to support the artists, because I think everyone does it because we understand, even though, like you say, some people haven't really thought it out. I think some do understand that it's so important that art must be produced, and authentic art must be produced, because that's the only way we can develop.
I come from academia, so I'm always thinking academia stuff, but there needs to be a scholarship. There are scholarships that study these things, the institutional analysis, to understand the industry problems and challenges and stuff. There's also the message system analysis, studying the content, and the cultivation system analysis, measuring whether these contents are moving the needle one way or the other. And so those things need to be in place. So it's not just the artist, but looking at it from the scholastic perspective as well, and having those apparatus in place to be constantly monitoring and measuring progress, understanding the nuances, and being able to feed artists with the necessary information to be able to understand changes, trends, that sort of thing.
Ask my last two questions, then I'm going to open it up to the audience. And at this stage, I want to ask you, particularly your work, Isaac. When I saw your work, Mobilizing Oneness, and what you had to say about it, it's kind of moving from the idea of individual to universal, that there is a universality in individuality, that the one person is connected to the all. You've kind of erased your individual ego self to be a part of the universe. So in a sense, if you're going to bring it to this discussion, is kind of like erasing or moving from the particularity of the African label to the universality of the human label. It doesn't mean it's just a one-direction thing. It's constantly having a conversation. And I wanted to know your mindscape when you were creating this. Was this a political cause at the back of your head? Or it was the artist just moving with the spirit?
The artist is just moving with the spirit. I think it was a mix of things. It's always very hard for me to say, you know, there's one thing that's kind of sparked that's the piece that's still evolving, because different things keep happening that's keeping influencing me in different ways to take things in different directions. So it was a mix of things, but to bring it back to the idea of, I guess, transcending this idea of, you know, the box of Africanness to humanness or humanity. It ties in very directly with this discussion, because to me, the ideas that stereotypes spew out kind of limit people from being able to identify with us, because you might think of or see someone in a certain light because you've always heard one story, a single story about them, and so it makes it difficult to even see them in any other way, or even see them as human like yourself. And for me, it's a work that like I love the work I'm doing with that within that space, because it's very democratic. Everybody can access it. It's mobile. Everybody has a phone. Everybody can check it out, and it kind of shatters the I can't say it does, but slowly chips away at some of those misconceptions of what Africa or African art is or should look like, because we are not associated with being tech savvy or being in tune with the times. We're always painted as being primitive. And part of the motivation behind the work is to challenge ideas like that. And so, yes, it's work that is kind of a little bit politically influenced, but sometimes it's just, you know, me being myself.
So it was conscious and unconscious?
Kind of, yeah.
All right. So I'll actually want to open it up for questions now before I ask this last question, which I think is important. So if you want to ask any questions, just raise your hand.
Going back to the original question, what is Africanness? I'm curious because I didn't hear anybody mention the diaspora and how the diaspora is, what role the diaspora plays in that definition. So my father's Nigerian, my mother's from Trinidad. I was born in the United States. So I have like these multiple parts of my identity that are always kind of in conflict with each other. And I would like to hear what you guys have to say about that. People in the diaspora who are not like new immigrants, people who came, like my family is kind of a new immigration family story, but like people who come from the slave, even new immigrants, like first generations like myself. And then the other question I have, when you're asking how do you break stereotypes, and then you hear a lot of people saying you have to be true to yourself, and you have to be true to yourself as an artist, I kind of, and that there's not any responsibility to tell other people's story, just your own story. I want to throw back the question, what if, you guys are obviously privileged Ghanaians, you know, so what about the people who don't? No, I mean, my observation is, you know, people who've been to London School of Economics, that's a privilege that most people.
I work 3 jobs to pay my school fees.
That's, I see young women selling like stuff on the side of the road who will never make it there all day, you know, so I'm just saying so we have, myself, I'm a privileged African-American person, you know, I understand it. So I'm just saying, like, how do you reconcile your privilege and knowing that your privilege gives you a certain platform and gives you a certain voice where a lot of other Ghanaian people won't have that same voice and won't be able to contribute to the discussion. So in a way, your privilege makes you like a gatekeeper. And you know, you mentioned that people have the authority, can like tell your story for you. So then if you have privilege, are you telling other people's story for them as well?
I have to harken back to what Nkrumah said. I am African, not because I was born here, but Africa is within me. And I've seen Africa many places. I went to Dominican Republic, I saw African there. You go to New York, you're from New York. I mean, you're from the US, you've been in New York, I'm hoping. You see an African there. So you go to the Caribbean, the Maroons in Jamaica. Is that what they're called? But you go everywhere, in many places, you see them living their African selves. And so the African, like I said, cannot be reduced. It's fluid, it's everywhere. It shows its head up, it raises its head up in many places. The Mexicans have a rich African history. And I had a class full of Latino kids, and they didn't know that. And so I had to educate them on their own African history. They look Latino, they're from Mexico, some of them couldn't stand black people. They didn't realize they had African in them until I went through their history with them, because some of the first slaves that went there some of the first places they sent slaves were Santo Domingo and then Mexico. Mexico had the most. And so Africa is everywhere. To answer the first question, what was the second part of the question? Privilege. Telling other people's stories. I am a stickler for having people tell their own stories. I recall, I'm getting a little political, but during the time they were having the Red Friday, what was it? Occupy. I will call some of the people and I will be like, hey, how about you folks step back and give the microphone to the people who have no voice, those who cannot be heard. And if you were to step back and provide the logistical support, they have more of a story. The electricity and most of the stuff you were complaining about, I call middle-class problems. There are real problems. You go to Kolegono, you don't even have to leave Accra. My grandmother lived in Kolegono with no electricity. So if you're complaining about Dumso, right? Dumso is not a big deal for folks who never had electricity to begin with. And they live right here. And seed the stage and give it to them. As artists, these are some of the things you can bring out. There are amongst them lots of artists, lots of talent, and if you have to whom much is given, much is expected. And these are the people who you can give a platform to, and to have them tell their stories. The last thing, again getting a little bit political, but there was a lady from, I forgot which region, Eastern region somewhere, who won the parliamentarian seat, and there was this brouhaha about her not being educated enough, literate enough, cannot read the stuff. I was on the phone fighting with people because it's all about narratives. There's a reason why the people elected her. When the decisions are being made from people who do not have your lived experience, they have certain blind spots that they cannot see, and she brings a very rich narrative to the decision table. And she should have that seat. If she needs to get an interpreter, so be it. But they all speak Chi. She can speak their language. Her people nominated her over someone else. And so, yes, those things can be done. Those things should always be within the realm of, or the consideration set. If we're serious about addressing some of these issues, we should give a platform to the voiceless. There's a theory called the muted group theory, which addresses this in an expansive way, but they find different ways of communicating. As an African American, not really African American, but you know what I mean. Rap music was a back channel communication where we found ways to be able to articulate our oppression, right? There are many ways where people who don't have a voice find a way to articulate their oppression, and it's up to artists here to find that.
Speaking of communication theories, let me get a bit nerdy. We've spoken about content, the messengers. We haven't spoken enough about channels in this very increasingly sophisticated world of communication. And it's funny, this morning, all of the US news have been talking about Trump escaping his troubles by going into France, forgetting that French people watch CNN too. So the issue is this. When I was coming here, I caught up with my friend Marian and tried to drag her here, so she asked me what it was about. And I told her the topic, and she asked me, well, yeah, you need that, because she said some of my Facebook posts advance the theory, advance some of the stereotypes. What she might not have known is that each Facebook post has different audiences. So those that I think are negative are only go to my Ghanaian groups. And it didn't start that way. When I was living in the US, I was all gung-ho about sort of promoting positive news about Africa. And when I moved back here, that changed. I had a reverse culture shock, as many of you may have experienced. And I realized, oh my God, we have a problem. And so that changed the way, the things I was thinking about, the things I was talking about, and that prompted me to also separate my channels so that some things that are difficult conversations that must be among friends don't necessarily share them that way. However, I also believe that as a Ghanaian, as an African, and as a sometimes artist, it is also my responsibility, my civic responsibility, to sometimes share negative news or negative stereotypes with the world, because our leaders sometimes are more interested in pleasing foreigners than serving Ghanaians. And so it's also a strategic way of getting them to act. Which brings me to my question. For what purpose are we trying to end negative stereotypes? Is it to make the elite feel better? Or is there a strategic reason for it? Is it for investment? For the person in Kolegono who doesn't have any school to go to, who has to do number 2 on the street? Won't it be better for them for a negative story to prompt somebody to come and dash them something so they can live?
In your presentation, you indicated that the solution is the artists. I mean, the artists are the solution to the culture perception of the stereotype in Africa. And to what extent has the artists developed any comprehensive strategy to change that perception collectively?
And we've also talked at the same time about how there are certain challenges that face an African artist and that face our continent in general. So what is the process of negotiation between those two? And related to that, and in that process of negotiation between the individual authentic story and the broader challenges, does the concept of the African artist remain current and necessary?
So for Kabi, I think for me, okay, stereotypes come out of truth, right? These stereotypes exist because they're factual. I think the issue isn't necessarily completely dismantling the stereotype. The issue is providing diverse views of a people. So the artist being authentic to self and creating a story that doesn't exist is just providing a broader spectrum of what it means to be African or what it means to be Ghanaian. It doesn't mean that the person living in Kolegono going number 2's story isn't authentic, or that we should completely pretend that it doesn't exist so that we don't fix that problem. It's just opening up the scope of what it means to be Ghanaian, that it's not just this one story. But we should not cover up the truth that exists is that there is poverty in Accra right here, and we need to solve that. But that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that we should focus on. I think there's positive and negative, and it's critical for us as Ghanaians to be able to express ourselves as diverse. That's what I think.
The purpose should be to hold the mirror. Addressing the stereotypes is holding the mirror to the society and showing them. You basically do that on Facebook with your post. We think alike. I know we went to grade school together, so I know where he's coming from. But you're holding the mirror to the society and getting them to question themselves and view themselves and see themselves for what they are. And I think in a lot of ways, I went to go see one of Ebo White's plays, and he does that a lot with his art. To the minister right here, I'll have to point not too far from you, not too far behind you. Akwe, he's right there behind you. He's an artist. He won the same prize last year. Right, Akwe. The mic.
Yeah, okay. Bright uses his art to move the needle, to question society. There are many people doing it. Now, when I say art, I don't mean just visual arts, performance arts, movies, plays. There's a host of things that fall within that umbrella. And those are the things that shift culture. Those are the things that shift culture. They shift culture in the sense that they are not necessarily telling you to change. It's just a very subtle way of getting you to see the world differently. It's almost like an advertisement, sort of. Have you watched a Chinese movie before when you were younger? What did you do when you came out? Right. So the content start manifesting in your life. I remember getting into a fight with one guy who did this. And I'm like, you've been watching too many movies. But movies, in a real fight when we were kids, it just went this way. I was like, I don't know what kind of movies you've been watching. But the point is, it cultivates. There's a cultivating component to it. You watch Osofo Daddy. We used to watch Osofo Daddy back in the day. Soon as you go to school, what are you talking about? The show, what you see, and there's a multiplier effect to it. Several people watch it, and those who didn't even watch it get to know what happened because they were interacting. You watch a show, you talk about it. You watch stuff on TV, or you see stuff on Facebook, you talk about it, right? And so it has the ability to, and it's a slow-moving ship. Sometimes it takes generation to shift opinion. I worked in the PR field for a while, and we were in the business of shifting public opinion. And trust me, it takes a long time to shift groupthink, but it gets there. Those who started fighting for abolition of slavery, most of them didn't realize the things they fought for. Those who started fighting for women's rights from 1880s didn't realize, some still haven't realized, but some of the achievements that has come about as a result of their fight. So it's a slow-moving ship, but it's also a relay race. It's not a sprint. And so each person is supposed to run the best lap and pass the baton on to the next group. And you're always looking forward at grooming the next batch of runners to take it to the next point, knowing that you may not realize it, but someday a different generation will realize what you've been fighting for, and you know you've lived a good life with your work. I'll end with this. When the Wright brothers left what they call the intellectual artifact for flying, they had no idea we were going to go to space. When we went to space, we had no idea it was going to create the cell phone. But they left. When you leave behind how to do something, and artists leave their content behind, it becomes an intellectual artifact. Other people come and they move the dial forward and take it to a new frontier. And so that's how I see that happening.
Art is storytelling, and storytelling is art. And in creating your content, you leave an imprint of what you've created that transcends time. And I think that's why it's important that what you create is true, because it'll come back, people will interpret it, whether it's a sculpture from, ancient, whether it's a clay sculpture from ancient Africa, or it's something that people make today, it'll be interpreted. And it is in that interpretation that we build a codified story. And in that codified story, we can build bridges to other Africans. I mentioned that there's no one Africa, there are many Africas, and you also spoke about different Africas across the world. And speaking to the diaspora issue, I'm sorry for not mentioning the diaspora, but I truly included it when I was talking about inclusiveness, talking about understanding the differences and the commonalities, as Americans say, between one another that can build bridges so that we can together break the stereotypes that we all face. Some different from different parts of the world, depending on who you're speaking to. But when an African goes to the US or an American comes here, there's similar stereotypes that we face. I'm someone who was brought up all over Africa, but in Ghana, I'm not considered very Ghanaian sometimes. When I'm not in Ghana, I'm considered, very African. So depending on who you're speaking to, the stereotype changes. But what can help solve that problem is building the bridge and being inclusive. And at the moment, we have an artist in Untamed Empire. His name is Charles Guest. He's an African-American. He's a portrait artist. He actually has had one of his paintings in the White House because he painted a picture of the first Black Supreme Court Chief Justice. And it was put in, Obama bought it, and it was put in the White House. So we've been having this conversation. And coming back to the role of what the diaspora, of the diaspora in relation to African artists, I think you play a very big, very important role because you have access to so much that African artists here don't have. So your role is one of education, in teaching what you've learned. Your role is one of sometimes just being a patron and buying African art. Your role is just in supporting, and we as well would like to be able to build bridges to you. So I think once we are inclusive, I think everything will be all right.
Was your question answered? Touched on? No?
Sorry. So, yes.
All right.
Let's hear it again.
In your different artistic practices, what are the tools or strategies or thought processes that you use to negotiate maintaining your authentic voice and also dealing with some of the responsibilities that you may or may not feel as an African? And within that, does the idea, the notion of the African artist, is that still a useful concept?
For me, it's a capacity building issue. For me, the African artist faces challenges which boil down to not having, sometimes it's exposure, sometimes it's lack of education, sometimes it's lack of materials, sometimes it's as simple as that. But once you have the vision, and you need to try and make that vision reality, sometimes there's nothing that can stop you from doing that. Sometimes you get frustrated because you're not able to, and I'm not a creative, I'm not an artist myself, I'm an economist. But what I do is I support creatives from the back. And so in talking to them, I've realized that they need support. I mean, nobody can do anything by themselves, right? And artists are very sensitive, and they sometimes need to be nurtured. And that's why I mentioned that galleries that find artists they consider to be talented sometimes can kill the artist because they then could in negotiating with themselves feel like they need to produce work just for the sake of surviving, and then they end up, damaging what their craft could have been as a result of that. Sometimes they become even greater. It always varies. But I think the negotiation that exists is to be open to the possibility that you can't do it all, and that there are certain skills that you may need that you may not have. And this is why everyone has to contribute to building the arts, because the artists can't do it themselves. And those who want to build an industry within the arts can't do it without the artists. So we need each other, and the reality is we need to identify the touch points between all of us that can link us together. Yeah. I didn't answer it, did you?
Okay, I will attempt to answer this as someone who identifies as an artist. So for me, the authenticity aspect of the question is I think it's very key or very important to me, because the only way I feel like anything genuine or any art that you can really describe or connect with deeply is when it comes from contemplation, when it comes from, going within, trying to find whatever it is that is yourself, and expressing that in some way about some idea that matters to you, or whatever it is that's going on in your environments that you want to talk about. It's trying to go within. It's a very vague thing to say, but it's like that process of meditating or contemplating a particular idea, or trying to find out or understand your purpose is very important. So in being authentic as an artist, and the way that connects with the idea of an African artist for me is something I have to, be, I guess, personal. I have to personalize. So for me, learning is a very important part of my craft. I'm very intentional about trying to understand more and more this world, or how we are here, because it's all very miraculous, and we are all, in one way or the other, trying to make sense of it. And within that space, there have been, unfortunately, certain people, or people with various agendas, who have made it such that there are divisions, there are categorizations. People have been compartmentalized and put in certain spaces. And Africans, or Africa, with all the stereotypes, unfortunately falls into like a muted group, going back to the muted group theory of where there's a dominant culture and someone subservient or someone below. So in that context, it's like looking at myself as an artist who's aware of something like this going on. It's my role, I feel, to go back, look at our actual histories that are, for some reason, discarded from mainstream knowledge, and drawing upon that to tell a story I feel is important, to tell a story that stereotypes kind of neglect. And so that is my way of, I guess, staying true to my authenticity, but trying to address the problem with stereotypes, or African stereotypes, to be more specific. But the thing is, not every artist, or not every artist's authentic expression, or not every African artist's authentic expression is about, trying to dispel certain narratives, or trying to be intentional about telling another story. They are just telling a story, their story. But it's the role of those who are conscious of the larger problem, if we can call it that, to talk about it. And hopefully other African artists will also feel the need to be more intentional about, like I have to share the story. I have to, go learn or dive deep into history, or just listen to other people and use those little bits of knowledge you draw from them to craft a different narrative. So yeah, I don't know if it answers your question. Maybe it's like tangentially, like totally off, but that's kind of what I gathered from the question you asked. And if yeah.
So I think the second part of your question was, is the African artist, like, is that necessary? Is that tag still necessary? And I think for me, I didn't answer the first part of your question because I feel like my authentic self is tied to my Africanness, so my work is inherently African. Whether that's questioned or not is a different thing. I'm aware that my Ghanaianness is questioned in certain spaces. Like, I went to a school in Ghana that when I tell people, they tell me, you didn't go to school in Ghana if you went to that school. So I understand that. But as far as is the tag of being an African artist still necessary? For me personally, it is when the work travels. Because of stereotypes, when your work travels, they try to dilute it, right? They try to make it as comfortable for the space that it's traveled to as possible. I think Sefa touched on that when she talked about an artist having their work in a gallery and they're reproducing the same work. So in that context, it becomes necessary for me to hold strong to that tag, right? So this is an African story. Nicole will tell you for an African city, when it's traveled, there've been questions about, well, we love this show, but can it be a bit more this? Can it be a bit more that? But the story is about 5 African women living in Ghana. So I think once your work travels, if your story is about being African and you sort of hold firm in that, you have to hold strong to that African. I'm an African artist, I'm telling this African story, and whether it's in Germany, the States, London, this is what I'm holding to, so that your work isn't sort of diluted for another purpose.
I'm an artist myself, and I'm considering what the tag African artist means, to the point where is it content-based, is it contest-based? And by this I mean, am I an African artist because I'm living in Ghana and producing art from Ghana? Or if I'm still Ghanaian but living in the US and producing works that are which has the American content, am I still an African artist? Also, when I'm touching on a more broader issue like politics or economic issues, which is quite global, does my practice remain Ghanaian or African? But I think I wanted to understand more to the point where my work, when it travels from Ghana to maybe the US or Europe, it doesn't carry the Africanness, because even though the issues are rooted in Ghana, economics, my work always runs around Ghanaian economy, which is all being influenced by European or American influences. I collaborate with other people, scientists from US and maybe some technical people from Germany. So with their hands in my work, does it make it still an African tag to call it myself as an African artist, or is it because I'm coming from Ghana, so I should be an African artist?
The thing as human beings is that are we being reactive or proactive as artists, assuming that we are going to challenge something, and whether stereotype or not, you want to challenge something, but are you being reactive or proactive in your response? Based upon our history, are we being reactive? We find a lot of times we go back into the past and we create images reflecting what we've already done 300-400 years ago, which is fine. However, if the history had not happened, where would we be creating art? Or how would we be creating art today? We would not be making those masks, I doubt, or we might be. So, do not be pulled so far back into the past, even though Sankofa is a good idea, because if that hadn't happened. So what are you creating now that people can say, wow, have you ever seen something like that before? Because sometimes some of our artists come across a situation where it is, are you sure this was done by you? Or are you sure it's been done by an African? So what, you know what I'm saying? So that's one reason to, so that should question how you're responding to it. Some of our art should be like, quote unquote, R&D. What do you think is going to be happening in 20, 30 years' time?
So what do you think will be happening in 20, 30 years' time? And then as you answer that, this is to all of you, to end this nicely. Telling tall stories, the responsibility of the African artist. How do we, at this stage, to end nicely, include our history, our spirituality, our all the other things that surround, that make our lives? How do we include it in the arts such that Africans are educated about the fact that our history didn't begin with colonialism, and also with spirituality, how not to be too preachy and be more inclusive of other people, all these things. How can we make responsible art, in a sense, to end that? So let's answer his, and then we'll end with that, each from you. And also just tell us, if you want to praise anyone you know who is challenging the stereotype, please feel free to mention their names now and their work now before you go.
There are many stories to tell, and one of the things that's been a passion of mine is to try to get, raise this awareness to a bunch of artists to look at other stories beyond the narratives that is coming out. By and large, if you do a content analysis of most of, I'll focus on just movies, you realize that in most American movies, there's a problem. And at the end of the narrative, Americans figured out the solution to the problem they solved, and then yay, they're the protagonists, they are the heroes of the day. And over a period of time, it has created a composite image of Americans. That if you live in any corner of the world, you think Americans solve problems. When I got there and I realized there are dumb Americans, I was like, wait a minute, there are dumb people here? I was shocked. I started my class. First time I started my class, I thought I couldn't compete with these people. And realizing, oh, these people are really dumb. Like, I'm serious, there are lots of dumb people there. And I didn't know that. Because the movies, the composite image I had of United States was different. When you look at our movies, I'm not talking of all of them, but if you take a majority of them and you do a content analysis, you realize there's a problem. And some other entity is the person or the entity that solves the problem for us, whether it be juju, or it be God, or it be something else but us. And it makes me wonder if the the World Trade Center crash, the economic crash that had happened here, would we be praying, or will we be harnessing our best minds to solve the problem? And I have a feeling we all know what the answer will be. And that comes from the way we see ourselves. And we see ourselves that way because of the content we consume. And so, forecasting into the future, I'm actually optimistic. Because there was a time when the printing press came about, it led to the era of enlightenment, where people were reading, their minds were expanding, and it led to the invention of light and science and other philosophies and many, what have you. This internet provides a second age of enlightenment. People can generate content, and he talked about channels, he's gone, but we could throw it on the internet, we could throw it on YouTube, we could have different avenues to get our messages out. And so I'm optimistic about 20, 30 years, and I've seen just coming down for a series of years, being here, lots of artists using their work, her work, his work. I remember Akwe, Bright's work, and many other folks I met and I meet when I come down. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because I know there are people who are trying to do that, and they're speaking their voice. What I hope to do is be able to nudge them to be cognizant of the fact that they have a very integral role to play in the building of the nation.
So for me to wrap up, I think the responsibility of the African artists, like I've said before, is just to first of all be honest and authentic about your own experience within the context of Africa or Ghana, wherever you are, and tell those stories. So for me, for example, the next thing that I'm working on is a documentary about mental health disease. And that's only because my mother had 5 siblings and 4 of them suffered from mental health disease. And so for me, I feel like it's my responsibility to use my art to dig deep into, well, how are we handling mental health disease in Ghana? And that's authentic to me. That's not somebody else's experience. So I think our responsibility is to look within ourselves, tap into what is true to us, and project that to the world in the most authentic way possible.
The role of the African artist in the future, I believe, will be so instrumental to defining art. And I think the African artist will be, or African art will be the first art that will end up being defined as human art. Because I think African artists, partly as a result of our condition, has not been tainted, has not been, is still true to our culture. And I believe that if the African artist is able to be true to themselves, even if they have nothing, and they're able to just look within their culture and look within their immediate surroundings of the different faces of Africa. I think if they're able to produce, because as a continent, we're communal, we're open, we're inclusive, I think we will be the human art. I think we'll end up breaking the stereotype of being only African, and I think we'll be human. And I don't think any continent will be able to do that except for Africa, because of our diversity and because of our history and because of the richness of our culture.
Okay, so I guess I'll take it from where you asked about which artists or creators out there are pushing out other stories that challenge the stereotypes. And one of the ones I really admire, Chimamanda. And so to wrap up, I would read a quote from her talk, TED Talk, about the danger of a single story, which is perfectly aligned with this topic. So she says, all of these stories make me who I am, but to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is that it's not that they are not true, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. Of course, Africa is a continent full of catastrophes. There are immense ones, such as the horrific rapes in Congo, and the depressing ones, such as the fact that 5,000 apply for one job vacancy in Nigeria. But there are other stories that are not about catastrophe. And it is very important, it is just as important to talk about them. And that's why I feel artists are important. Artists are here to, move the needle, change the direction, the gaze, so we see a fuller picture of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So to less flat, more rounded, more human African art. A huge round of applause to our panelists. They've been amazing. And a huge round of applause to you. You've kept the conversation really, really deep. Thank you. At this stage, we will end things by inviting the co-chairman of the Kwenyehia Trust for Contemporary Art, Thelma Tewia, to give us the vote of thanks.
The Kwenyehia Trust for Contemporary Art is really interested in enhancing the ecosystem for arts in Ghana and in Africa. And we hope that with our prize and with our thought leadership seminars, we can create interesting conversations, starting with each one of us here and knowing our place in how we can help art and artists and tell our African story. When we are selecting our winners, we try to pick people who can speak to their craft, who have a purpose for their art, who can explain the thinking that went into what they were trying to produce, because we realize the immense responsibility that our artists have. And we hope that you've enjoyed this session. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you all for coming, and we hope when we invite you for our other sessions, you will be part of it. Have a good evening.
Akbanono de kakwe Nato nyokoroto na kwe Akbanono de kakwe Namo chimo namore na kwe Okoga Nukara la shivo vamos como tudo Nukara la shivo vamos chimo tudo Ai Amo to chimo mo como tudo Amo to chimo mo como Namo chimo akanya kuno naro Biancuno na dori ato no korotora kwe. Easy.
Yeah, you know be. Where we dey go, where they talk. It be what we dey do before we dey go, how they talk. Your life be one pair, my guy. Forget say we all did that. Focus on the positive, that be too negative, my guy. It be my thoughts, it be your thoughts. We just dey talk, but we dey learn. It be my thoughts, I just dey talk. You go fit take, you go feel left. But me, I talk, I jam my eye, your eye. They see self, I dey lie. What you do, plus your brain, your heart.